I'm 34 and live alone in a rather large house. I was married and had kids, but I'd gotten divorced the year before. This house is meant for a large family, but I've never had the time to move out, so I just stayed. Being the only person in a large house, a lot of sounds resonate through the empty house all the time. The most common sound was from the air conditioner, and the entire time I heard sounds coming through but had no clear definition. It would make a hollow thud sound in the walls, which would then resonate through the house, sounding much louder than it actually was. Don't get me wrong, it was creepy at first, but I got used to it. Anyway, this happened on a Thursday night after I got home from a long day at work. I went straight upstairs and took my work clothes off to put something more comfortable on, then jumped on the bed and turned on the TV in my room. Beating the TV, I tried to listen for the sound of something, then jumped on the bed and turned on the TV in my room. I didn't spend much time downstairs because I didn't need to. I had everything in my room, so the only time I would be downstairs for more than a couple minutes was if I was in the kitchen. I lay back and rested my eyes. After a moment, through the TV playing, I heard that familiar sound. I didn't even open my eyes. I just continued to rest. An hour later, somehow having not fallen asleep, I got up, getting hungry for dinner. I turned the TV off and opened my bedroom door, and almost on cue, that bang sound resonated again. I'd never recalled the AC making that sound more than once or twice a day, especially without touching the thermostat. I walked across the hallway to where the upstairs thermostat was. It was off, which means that it had been off all day. I wasn't fully scared yet though. My initial reaction was to try and figure out why the air conditioner was running while I had it off. I was really just upset that this inconvenience had to happen tonight. I went downstairs into the kitchen. The only thing I had left in my fridge was leftover pizza from a few days ago, so I set the oven and heated it up. I stood in the kitchen on my phone while I waited. Again, this time it was much louder and felt like it even shook the house. This was the moment I started to get scared. I hadn't convinced myself fully that this wasn't just the AC acting up, but other possibilities were starting to creep into my mind. Once the pizza was done, I ate quickly, then figured it best to go into the basement and check the AC unit. I didn't want to be creeped out the whole night. I just wanted to know what it was and be done with it. I opened the basement door and flicked on the light. There was nothing special to this basement. It was unfinished and just had some old furniture, along with some boxes with seasonal decorations in them. I walked down the steps to the bottom, then walked over to the AC unit. I wasn't sure what to look for, so I was kind of just looking around for anything obviously wrong. And while I didn't find anything, I did notice that it was completely off. Nothing was running. It had to be something else, which was not giving me the peace of mind I was looking for. I started walking back to the stairs, planning to check some other rooms on the first floor. But just as I started walking, I saw a figure right under the steps. The lighting was dim, but his eyes gave away his position. The person was crouched down behind some boxes under the stairs. I knew he saw me looking at him as we were making eye contact, and I had completely stopped walking. In hindsight, I wish I had pretended to not notice and continued walking, but in the moment, I couldn't help my reaction. Once I snapped out of it, I sprinted up the steps and slammed the door behind me, locking it shut and putting a kitchen chair up against it. I didn't hear them following me, so I took it as a sign that they weren't here to fight. I called the police while standing next to the basement door in case they tried to escape. I was scared, but I also didn't want them to get away. I stayed on the line until the lady said the officers were 3 minutes away. Then I heard it again. The person down there was hitting something. Over and over, heavy blows hitting something solid. It seemed like either the concrete floor or the wall. The resonance of the hits, though, It felt too heavy to not destroy the wall, so I assumed the floor, but I had no idea why. After maybe 20 hits, it went silent. Moments later, officers came to the door. They captured the man downstairs quickly, and he surprisingly looked like a very normal man. Regular clothes, well-groomed, didn't really look like he would be someone to break into a home. The officers brought up 2 tools as well, a thick crowbar and a large hammer. Then, retaining the man and putting him in the car, one of them brought me into the basement to show me what was going on. In the far corner, opposite of the AC unit, there was rubble and plywood shards all over the ground. I don't know how I didn't notice it. On the wall, though, were huge indents of metal. It was almost unrecognizable, but it was a small, old safe that was built into the wall. The damage that was done to the wall safe looked insane, and I was shocked that it hadn't given in. It's funny though, because there was nothing in it. I do remember the seller mentioning it and giving me a code when we moved in, but I never bothered to stash anything in there. The officers I was talking to said they'd seen it before in a lot of the big homes around the area, as a lot of burglars go straight to the safe and often don't loot anything else in the house. Of everything, the fact that the man looks so normal is what creeped me out the most. Just knowing that literally anyone could be doing things like this is not a comforting thing to think about. I ended up repairing the wall and just covering the safe. I also plan to move out soon and get a smaller house that's easier for me to stay alert in, because this situation could have been a lot worse than it was, and I don't want to take any chances next time. I was at home making dinner on a regular night after work. It was around 7 p.m. or maybe even later, and I had gotten home from work only an hour before. I wasn't making anything fancy, just a small chicken breast and some frozen corn. I had just finished with the chicken and began draining the water from the corn when a light scraping sound came through the house. It was short and quick and not very loud, but the strangeness of the sound made me flinch a little. I continued doing what I was doing, thinking it was just some weird sound that the house was making that I had just never heard before. But then again, that same scraping sound vibrated through the walls. It was such an unusual sound, I had no idea what to think of it. I quickly finished plating my food, then went toward the front door to listen for it again, hoping to pinpoint where it was coming from. I waited for maybe 30 seconds, not hearing anything, then went back to the table to eat. Even still at this point, I wasn't thinking anything of it. I was only curious as to why the house was making that sound, but I wasn't worried in the slightest. I spent a few minutes eating, then went over to the couch to rest and watch some Netflix for a bit. But through the show, I would constantly hear that obnoxious scraping sound over and over. Eventually, it was just getting so aggravating that I turned off the TV and just waited, listening. When the sound came again, I was able to hear it more clearly coming from somewhere upstairs. I quickly walked up to the second floor, still just annoyed at the house for ruining my night, but also a bit more concerned that there may actually be something wrong with the house. At the top of the steps, I stayed in the hallway, waiting again for the sound. A whole minute went by of nothing, so I began searching the rooms to make sure everything was okay. It didn't seem like anything was unusual or broken, so now I was starting to really get confused and worried. I put some shoes on and went outside, and while it was dark, I figured I'd maybe be able to see a tree scraping against the house, or possibly some other issue. I went to the side of the house where I knew there was a tree, but it wasn't windy at all, and the branches were nowhere near the side. I kind of just stood there, wondering how this was happening and why it suddenly started tonight. I was tired, and this was the last thing I wanted to be doing. I walked back around to the front of the house, and on my way to the front door, a glimmer of light came in the side of my vision. I turned and looked, as it seemingly came from the front of the house. I walked further down the driveway by the sidewalk and looked back, and that's when I saw a small light coming from one of the windows in a dark room of my home. After a couple seconds, I realized it was the attic window, and that the light was moving, almost like someone was shining a flashlight around. I was horrified. Someone was in my attic doing who knows what and for how long. I stayed out front, calling the police as I stared at the window, watching the light move around slowly, but as I was talking on the phone, the light got dimmer before shining directly at me. They held it there for a couple seconds, then shut it off, and even from outside I was able to hear a few loud thuds. I immediately ran over to my neighbor's yard, trying to explain to the operator what was going on while looking over at my house in terror. From where I was, it looked silent and calm, but that only made it more scary, knowing that something awful was likely going on inside. After a few minutes, though, nothing else was seen and the cops finally made it. They searched the house first, then brought me inside to talk. They found multiple shoe prints in the attic, and they suspected it was likely a group of teenagers messing around with me and likely not trying to cause any harm. There were no signs of anyone living there or anything, which was a relief. They found some carvings in the wooden beams, though, but they weren't anything specific, just lines basically. Again, the cops assured me that the kids were probably just messing with me and trying to get a reaction out of me. As for how they got in, they think they may have somehow gotten on the roof and climbed in through a window while I was at work that day. However, they exited through the attic doorway on the ceiling and got out through my back door. I know they said confidently that it was a harmless group of kids, but that doesn't make me feel any safer. Knowing that some random group of people broke into my house and was camping out there all day and at night while I was home is really unnerving. I mean, those cops didn't actually know what the group's intentions were, so who knows what they actually planned on doing. When I was 20 years old, I lived in a very small, one-bedroom apartment that I'd moved into when I turned 18. Having a better job and more money in the bank, I decided to rent a small house and leave the apartment. It wasn't anything fancy, but it had more space and was a nice step up from where I used to live. The only thing I didn't account for was that everything looked off. Coming from the apartment, my furniture was way too small and didn't match the interior of the home. It just looked like I moved into a house larger than I could afford. So over the next couple months, I saved up more money and put it aside to buy new furniture. And during these months, I also listed a whole bunch of stuff on Craigslist to start getting rid of. Aside from the couch and a couple other things, I listed most of the dressers, storage shelves, and other large furnishings for free. I didn't care about getting paid, so long as they were able to help me haul it out of my house. I sold and gave away most of the items until only 2 things were left: my old bedroom dresser and a nightstand, which nobody seemed to want. After a month though, someone finally contacted me about them. They asked if both of them were still available and if they were actually free. I said yes to both, and we agreed on a date for pickup. On that day, I didn't get home from work until an hour before the time they were supposed to come. But when I pulled up to my house, there was a truck in the driveway. I went up beside them and looked in the window, but nobody was in sight. I opened the garage and parked, then went back outside to further inspect the random truck in my driveway. When I looked this time, though, someone was in the car. They waved and got out, introducing themselves as the person from Craigslist here to pick up the furniture. I took a second to react, because I was trying to figure out where they were when I pulled in. "You're an hour early." He said he was sorry, but something came up, so he needed to come early. I still didn't understand why he didn't text me before coming unannounced, but since he was here, I showed him inside. He looked at the items for a second and said he'd take them. I helped him haul out the large dresser and put it in his truck bed. We went back in for the nightstand, but as he picked it up, a shuffling sound came from downstairs, followed by a quiet thump. I looked down the staircase, then back at the man, who was now looking at me in a very unsettling way. "Everything okay?" he said in a very monotone voice. I hesitantly nodded and walked downstairs, showing him out. I closed the door behind him and watched out the window to make sure he left. That whole interaction was very odd from beginning to end, but what I found after was horrifying. Later that night, I saw a small streak on the wall just outside one of the downstairs closets, like someone had brushed against it. I looked around some more, finding very faint shoe prints inside the closet. Someone had clearly been hiding in there. I put 2 and 2 together, and I was pretty sure there was another person in my house along with the man. They broke in before I got home from work, and when they heard me pulling into the driveway, One of them hid in the closet while the other went back to the car. The shuffling sound I heard toward the end was likely the other person leaving the closet. I had the police do what they could, but the two men seemed to cover up their tracks. I gave them descriptions of the one man I saw and the truck he was driving, but that was that. It was a terrible experience, and after that, I only used Craigslist when I could avoid meeting at my house. Otherwise, I would just donate things or buy stuff off eBay. It feels like nowadays anyone can do anything and get away with it so easily as long as they plan ahead.